In the last 72 hours, 3 distinct militia networks across 3 different sovereign nations have simultaneously shifted to combat-ready status. The triggers are not being pulled in Tehran, but the signal to mobilize undeniably originated there. Welcome back to our deep dive into global news and geopolitics, where today we are analyzing the immediate fallout of the targeted strike on Iran's top military chief. If you are watching the headlines, you might think we are standing on the precipice of World War III. But the reality of US and Iran tensions right now is far more calculated and, frankly, far more focused on your wallet than on a global nuclear exchange. The early warning systems of the United States and its allied bases across the Middle East are flashing red as we speak. This is the breaking point of the shadow war. A boundary has been crossed, and the response was initiated within 60 minutes. But why should this matter to you right now? Because the target of this mobilization is not just concrete bunkers or desert outposts. The real target is the fragile architecture of the global economy. There is a common assumption floating around right now. People assume that when a high-ranking Iranian military figure is targeted, Tehran will respond with the full conventional might of its armed forces, that they will march into a total, devastating war. That assumption is fundamentally flawed. Iran's most dangerous weapon is not its standing army. Its most effective weapon is the chaos of plausible deniability executed through a decentralized network of proxy forces. To understand the gravity of this 3-pronged mobilization, we have to look at the board just moments before this turning point. For months, Washington and Tehran have been locked in a state of fragile deterrence. It has been a deadly dance. Both sides have been throwing punches, but always carefully keeping the impact just below the threshold that would demand an all-out, undeniable declaration of war. But targeting a chief architect of Iran's military strategy changes the math. It shatters that fragile ceiling. Now, we need to briefly map out the mechanics of this proxy network, because the word proxy gets thrown around on the news without much context. Think of it as a franchise model for regional influence. Iran provides the seed capital, the advanced weaponry, and the ideological framework. In exchange, they get long-reaching, deniable arms operating in Lebanon, across the plains of Iraq and Syria, and down to the rugged coasts of Yemen. The core interests here are completely opposed, yet perfectly gridlocked. The United States needs to maintain its regional presence to protect its allies and secure vital global shipping lanes. But the absolute last thing Washington wants is to get bogged down in another trillion-dollar, decades-long ground war in the Middle East. On the other side of the chessboard, Tehran faces immense domestic pressure. They absolutely must save face and project strength after a high-profile loss of their military elite. However, their domestic economy, already crippled by years of heavy sanctions, simply cannot survive a direct conventional shootout with Western air power. So, how do you fight a war when you cannot afford to actually declare one? You press the button that activates your franchises. But here is the critical pivot, and it is a reality that many analysts are currently getting wrong. The prevailing narrative suggests that Tehran controls these 3 proxy groups like perfect marionettes on a string. Pull the left string, Hezbollah fires a rocket. Pull the right, the Houthis seize a ship. The terrifying truth is that this network is heavily decentralized. They are highly autonomous franchises with their own local grievances, their own internal politics, and their own trigger fingers. Once the mobilization order is given, reining them back in is nearly impossible. Let us break down exactly who is moving right now and what their specific, localized capabilities actually mean for the global board. We are looking at 3 distinct spears being leveled at the same time. First, in the Fertile Crescent covering Iraq and Syria, groups like Kataib, Hezbollah, and allied factions have heightened their alert status. These are the localized pressure points. Their primary utility is direct, localized harassment of US troop concentrations. Second, down south in Yemen, the Houthi movement has visibly accelerated the movement of their anti-ship missile batteries. Their role is entirely different. They are the economic lever. And third, to the north, in Lebanon, Hezbollah, the crown jewel of the proxy network, has mobilized its southern command. They possess an arsenal of precision-guided munitions that rivals small European nations. They are the ultimate deterrent, the doomsday switch meant to prevent a direct invasion of Iranian soil. But to truly grasp what is happening, we have to look past the military hardware and look at the ledger. We need to talk about financial asymmetry. In the modern era of geopolitical conflict, blowing up a multi-million-dollar installation is great for television ratings, but bleeding a superpower's treasury dry is how you actually win a war of attrition. Consider the brutal mathematics of this mobilization. A proxy group in Yemen or Iraq can launch a swarm of modified, commercially available drones. The cost to manufacture and deploy one of these drones might sit somewhere around $2,000. To swat that $2,000 piece of plastic and wiring out of the sky, the United States Navy often has to fire a Standard Missile 2 or a Standard Missile 6. The cost of just one of those interceptors ranges from $2 million to over $4 million. Every time an alarm sounds, every time a cheap drone is launched to test the perimeter, it forces a multi-million-dollar response. It is an economic hemorrhage disguised as a security threat. And right now, by mobilizing all three proxy fronts simultaneously, they are attempting to multiply that financial drain by a factor of 3. This is not just a military maneuver. It is a highly coordinated, asymmetric financial attack. This brings us to the operational theater of the gray zone. Gray zone warfare is specifically designed to inflict just enough pain to force a political concession while remaining just ambiguous enough to deny the adversary a clear, legal, or political justification for a devastating counterstrike. It is a masterclass in pushing the envelope without tearing it. And right now, the envelope is being pushed at 3 critical pressure points simultaneously. Let us dissect the first prong of this mobilization, focused across the volatile plains of Iraq and Syria. Here, the localized militia networks are not mobilizing to conquer heavily fortified American bases. That is not their objective. Their objective is to create American casualties. Why? Because in the modern political landscape, dead soldiers create immediate visceral pressure in Washington. It transforms a distant foreign policy issue into a burning domestic crisis. In an election cycle, the mere threat of flag-draped coffins returning home forces the administration to carefully weigh the political cost of every single retaliatory strike. This is not about military victory for the militias. It is about leveraging the internal democratic pressures of their enemy. Now, shift your focus south to the second prong, the Houthi movement in Yemen. This is perhaps the most globally disruptive element of the entire mobilization. By moving anti-ship missile batteries out of deep storage and aiming them at the Red Sea, they are not just threatening military vessels. They are holding a gun to the head of global shipping. The Bab el-Mandeb Strait is one of the world's most critical maritime choke points. If you force major shipping conglomerates to reroute their cargo vessels around the Cape of Good Hope in Africa, you are instantly jacking up transit times by 2 to 3 weeks. You cause marine insurance premiums to skyrocket. You disrupt supply chains from Rotterdam to Shanghai. And you inevitably drive up the cost of a barrel of Brent crude. Suddenly, Europe and China are feeling the economic sting of a conflict they are not even fighting in. And what happens next? Those global powers start quietly pressuring Washington to de-escalate, to compromise, just to get the cargo ships moving again. It is geopolitical judo. It is using the sheer weight and interconnectivity of the global economy against your adversary. Finally, we look north to the third and most formidable prong, Hezbollah in Lebanon. This is the crown jewel of the proxy network. The mobilization of their southern command is the ultimate insurance policy for Tehran. They possess an arsenal of tens of thousands of rockets and precision-guided munitions that rivals the inventories of several mid-sized European nations combined. But here is the crucial distinction. That arsenal is not necessarily meant to be fired today. It is meant to sit fully fueled on their launch pads, pointing relentlessly south. It is a doomsday switch, guaranteeing that if Western or allied forces attempt a direct, decapitating strike on Iranian soil, the entire Levant will immediately burn. This brings us to a contrarian reality, an insight that completely upends the popular narrative currently dominating the news cycle. You will hear pundits and talking heads screaming that this loud, public mobilization is the definitive prelude to World War III. It is not. In the brutal, calculated logic of deterrence, a highly publicized mobilization is actually a form of negotiation. It is diplomacy conducted through the language of imminent threat. Think about it. The most terrifying weapon in this scenario is not the missile soaring through the sky. Once a missile is fired, it simply becomes a complex math problem for a billion-dollar air defense system to solve. No, the truly terrifying weapon is the missile sitting on the launch pad, forcing the enemy to paralyze their own society, ground their own flights, and empty their own treasury in perpetual anticipation of an attack that might never come. To understand why the West is treading so carefully, we must do the grim mathematics of a saturation attack. The United States and its regional allies possess some of the most sophisticated air and missile defense shields on the planet. The Patriot batteries, the Iron Dome, the David Sling, these are undeniable technological marvels, but they are bound by the inflexible laws of physics and the harsh realities of supply chains. An Iron Dome battery has a finite number of interceptors loaded into its tubes at any given moment. A Patriot system can only track and engage a specific number of incoming targets simultaneously. If these three proxy networks coordinate to launch 2,000 cheap, unguided rockets and loitering munitions in a single, synchronized wave, the defense systems will absolutely intercept the first 100. They will likely intercept the first 500. But eventually, inevitably, the magazines run empty. The system becomes saturated, reloading takes precious time, and it is in that precise window of vulnerability that the heavier, far more destructive, precision-guided ballistic missiles can slip through the net. That is the nightmare scenario keeping defense planners awake tonight. Yet, as we analyze this grand chessboard, as we talk about drone swarms, interceptor yields, and geopolitical judo, we must confront a deeply uncomfortable reality. The people who will pay the heaviest price for this high-stakes game of chicken are not sitting in air-conditioned war rooms in Washington, nor are they in heavily fortified bunkers in Tehran. The true cost is being extracted right now from the civilian populations of Lebanon, Yemen, and Iraq. These are sovereign nations already teetering on the edge of total economic collapse. Their currencies are in freefall. Their civilian infrastructure is crumbling. And now, they are effectively being drafted as human shields. Their neighborhoods are being transformed into testing grounds for a proxy war they did not ask for and cannot afford. The strategy of attrition and proxy warfare might be brilliant on a strategist's whiteboard, but on the ground, it is paid for with the lives, the security, and the futures of millions of ordinary people who are simply trying to survive the week. This brings us to a fascinating disconnect between what is being broadcast on television and what is actually happening behind closed doors. If you tune into state media right now, you will hear fiery rhetoric. You will hear promises of devastating, apocalyptic revenge. But geopolitics is rarely dictated by the loudest voice in the room. If you look past the public broadcasts and track the diplomatic back channels, a very different picture emerges. Right now, secure lines in Oman and Switzerland are buzzing with frantic, high-stakes communication. Messages are being passed indirectly between Washington and Tehran. The public language is burning hot, but the strategic calculations being made in the shadows are ice cold. They are attempting to choreograph a response that satisfies domestic anger without triggering regime collapse. So, where does this mobilization actually lead? When three proxy armies stand at the ready, how does the board resolve itself? If we strip away the emotion and look strictly at the strategic incentives, there are three distinct scenarios unfolding right in front of us. The first is the best case scenario. We can call this the return to the status quo. In this timeline, the mobilized proxy forces launch a series of highly telegraphed, heavily publicized strikes. But crucially, they aim for empty patches of desert, abandoned outposts, or facilities that have already been evacuated. They create massive craters, film the explosions, and declare a historic victory for their domestic audiences. The United States and its allies intercept the incoming fire, report 0 casualties, and claim their defense systems worked perfectly. Both sides declare victory. Face is saved, and the region steps back from the brink. The second scenario is the nightmare of miscalculation. In the gray zone, precision is a myth. The sheer volume of military hardware currently mobilized drastically increases the margin for error. In this worst-case timeline, a cheap loitering drone with a faulty GPS sensor drifts a mile off its intended course. Instead of hitting an empty runway, it slams into a crowded mess hall at a coalition base. The acceptable threshold of violence is instantly shattered. A red line is crossed. The pressure in Washington to respond directly to the source of the proxies becomes insurmountable, and we see stealth bombers targeting the command and control structures of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard directly. That is the domino effect that leads to a regional conflagration. But the third scenario is the most likely, and it is the one you need to prepare for. We can call this the slow bleed. In this timeline, there is no dramatic, cinematic climax. Instead, the mobilization settles into a prolonged, grinding campaign of low-intensity attrition. Drones are launched just frequently enough to keep air raid sirens wailing. Commercial ships are harassed just enough to keep maritime insurance premiums at record highs. This creates a phantom geopolitical tax. It is an invisible tariff applied to every barrel of oil, every shipping container of electronics, and every grain shipment moving from the east to the west. This is the true power of the proxy strategy. They do not need to defeat the United States Navy in a pitched battle. They only need to make the cost of doing business in the region intolerably expensive. This reveals a profound shift in the big picture of global power. We are witnessing the twilight of an era where a superpower could simply park an aircraft carrier strike group off a coastline and single-handedly dictate the regional order. We have fully entered the era of spiderweb warfare. Non-state actors, armed with off-the-shelf technology and asymmetric tactics, now possess the capability to paralyze the arteries of global trade. The centralization of power is shifting. And this brings us to the ultimate strategic paradox of targeting Iran's military chief. From a purely tactical standpoint, executing a precision strike against a master strategist is a brilliant intelligence coup. It disrupts planning and removes a seasoned veteran from the board. But strategically, it is akin to taking a baseball bat to a hornet's nest. You might successfully eliminate the queen, but in doing so, you have enraged the swarm. By removing the central architect who historically kept these proxy groups in line and coordinated their actions, the West may have inadvertently made the network vastly more dangerous. These mobilized militias are now more autonomous, less predictable, and operating with a decentralized vengeance that is far harder to deter. So, as we conclude this analysis, let us lock in on the central question we started with. Why mobilize 3 separate proxy armies within 60 minutes? They did not mobilize to start World War III. They mobilized to enforce a masterclass in psychological and economic warfare. Their objective is not to capture territory, but to capture the psychological advantage and drain the economic endurance of their adversaries. If you want to understand what happens next, you need to remember 2 core insights. First, in modern asymmetric warfare, economic sabotage is infinitely more effective than kinetic destruction. Bleeding an enemy's treasury is how you win the long game. Second, the most terrifying weapon in this entire standoff is not the deafening sound of a rocket launching. It is the calculated, agonizing silence of a missile sitting fully fueled on a launch pad, waiting for an order that may or may not come. Do not let the cable news headlines dictate your understanding of this crisis. If you want to know if the situation is actually escalating toward total war, do not just watch the troop movements. Look at the data. Watch the global shipping freight rates. Watch the spot price of Brent crude oil. Politicians will always spin the narrative, and state media will always broadcast propaganda. But the movement of money always tells the truth. Now, I leave the final verdict to you. Is this decentralized proxy strategy a stroke of defensive genius by Tehran, allowing them to project power without facing direct consequences? Or have they finally activated a chaotic machine that will inevitably slip from their control and drag them into the very war they have spent decades trying to avoid? Let me know your perspective in the comments below. If you found this breakdown valuable and want to continue deciphering the mechanics behind the headlines, make sure to subscribe. Until next time, keep questioning the narrative.